I promise to take exactly 1 minute to say welcome, everyone. It's very good to see so many of you here now, despite the weather. This is a special day during the Asia Journalism Fellowship that we run every year. The fellowship has been running for 9 years, and it is a brainchild of Temasek Foundation International and a certain Dr. Cherian George, who was at the Wee Kim Wee School at Nanyang Technological University when this started 9 years ago. The program is no longer at NTU. It has moved to the Institute of Policy Studies from this year. We have to keep our link to Cherian, so he's back tonight, and that's very nice, but someone else will introduce him. This year we have 16 fellows, and I'd just like them to stand up quickly. All right. And also here tonight, there are 8 of our former fellows from over the years. So if you want to just give us a wave, that's fine. Okay? Yeah, great. Welcome, one and all. So thank you all for being here. This year is also the first time that this partnership with Temasek Foundation got expanded some, and our partner for this forum is Temasek Foundation Connects, and it's a matter of making more friends. So this fellowship overall is about making friends and getting the network growing, and this forum is part of that. So I'm going to get off the stage now and let Carol Soon, who is the chair of the forum, come here and take over. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy dinner.
Okay, thank you, Alan. I'm Carol Soon, and I'm one of the associate directors of the Asia Journalism Fellowship. I'm also the senior research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. So welcome. It was a warm welcome we gave to SMS Chi this afternoon, and this evening is really cool now. So welcome guests far and near, friends and partners. So before we commence the keynote, here are just some announcements from my colleagues from the public affairs team. So the opening keynote is open for media coverage. It will be live streamed on the IPS Facebook page. So please do share the stream with your friends and colleagues who can't join us tonight. Now on the screen, you will see our Twitter handle at IPS_SG and the hashtag for the forum, hashtag AJF 2017. So we encourage all of you to tweet about the event. Now the keynote address will be recorded and it will be subsequently uploaded to the IPS YouTube page. So before we start, I have the pleasure of introducing Cherian. So if you look at the speaker's bio, you learn a few things about Cherian. One, he's currently an associate professor at the Department of Journalism at the Hong Kong Baptist University. Number 2, he spent many years at the Straits Times as a journalist, so most of us knew him for a very, very long time. Number 3, he's a very prolific and thought-provoking writer. He has written 4 books and his 5th is on the way. During dinner last night, he told me that his 5th book is a product of summer fancies. So how I wish we all have productive summer fancies like him. But what you don't know is what Alan just divulged. He's the father of the Asia Journalism Fellowship and the Asia Journalism Forum. So we're very, very delighted to have him here tonight. Cherian, please.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for the very warm and generous introduction from Carol, and to Alan for reminding us that this event, like everything AGF does, is about friendships. Alan is my oldest friend here, I guess, and Hedwig, wherever you are. And former students, former fellows whom I have had the pleasure of knowing before, the new fellows, who really are the guests of honor, I guess, of this whole event. And it's wonderful that you have made time to be with us here in Singapore. The old friends from Temasek Foundation International, newer friends from Temasek Foundation Connects. Did I get those names correct? Thank you. It's hard to keep up with all the rebranding, right? and to all of you as well who've sacrificing your evening and delaying your dinner for what you have been told will be an important address. I'm actually looking forward to learning from the scholars, journalists, and other professionals that the organizers have brought together for tomorrow's panels. And I'm glad that as the opening speaker, the burden isn't on me to answer all the difficult questions about fake news and the post-truth world. If you are waiting for answers, I believe Carol will be closing the conference tomorrow, and you will have all the answers. Right? All I'll do really is to maybe try and clarify some of the questions that are challenging the world today, and hope that we can approach them with more precision and finesse than I think we have. Now, experienced journalists know that when interest picks up in a new problem, you'd better pay attention because it may be newsworthy. But we also know that when it becomes too big, when interest starts to peak, when everybody's talking about it, we shouldn't get too caught up in the hype. We need to take a step back to get a wider view. And I think the fake news problem has reached that status, requiring our attention, yes, but also some circumspection. It is a real problem, but I think we should be quite clinical in the way we deal with it and not go for cures that are worse than the disease. This, I fear, is exactly what will happen if some governments get their way. In the name of combating fake news, they attack independent journalism. We see this tendency most clearly in Donald Trump's rhetoric, but I think the effects will be far worse in other countries that, unlike the United States, don't have strong constitutional protections for press freedom. Unfortunately, that includes most of Asia. This is why UNESCO has cautioned against the very use of the term fake news, pointing out that populist leaders have been using it to whip up hostility against legitimate professional media. I will still use the term fake news this evening, just out of convenience, but I hope that the health warning is clear. I'll also use the term disinformation, which I think may be a bit more precise. The fake news problem is part of a larger crisis in our profession, which I'd like to call a crisis of reason. Journalism, as we understand it today, is a product of the age of enlightenment. Professional journalism, like science, is based on the belief that human society progresses through the freedom to ask questions, to gather facts, to build and share knowledge, and then to ask questions again in an endless cycle. Journalism's core principles and practices are built on these Enlightenment beliefs. We treat facts seriously because we believe people's decisions should be guided by evidence, and we fight for freedom from censorship because we think it's through open competition that better ideas will reveal themselves. But there are growing doubts about the power of reason. Last year's events in the Western world have forced us to reevaluate our Enlightenment assumptions. In major contests between truth and falsehood, in Britain's Brexit referendum and the US presidential election, lies and misinformation triumphed. When people were presented with established facts, they simply refused to believe them, preferring instead to put their faith in what more reasonable minds knew to be untrue. We're now asking if we are living in a post-truth world. We in Asia are familiar with crises of government control in the press. We journalists are certainly familiar and getting used to crisis of financial survival. But this crisis of reason is in some ways the most devastating because it undermines the very premises of our profession. If facts don't count, if reason doesn't win, then what's the point of fighting for press freedom or searching for sustainable business models? Maybe we should just give up and move into public relations. But I hope you agree that such a conclusion is premature and that we should try to rise to this challenge. Fake news has suddenly arrived on the global agenda, not because it's really new, but because of these two gentlemen. The news about Russian fake news isn't fake news, although Trump thinks it is. Russians have had a sophisticated disinformation machinery dating back to the Soviet days, which it's currently using to nudge European neighbors closer to Moscow's sphere of influence and away from the EU and NATO. But the focus on Russia's role in Western politics can distort our perceptions of where the most serious disinformation threats actually come from. I've been thinking about what these might be, and I think here's a personal list. Here are 4 of what I would consider to be the fake news greatest hits of recent times. Fake news number 1, the health myth that smoking is okay. The campaign to block tobacco regulation. We know that for decades, big tobacco has worked very hard to suppress scientific evidence of the health risks of smoking. They've almost lost the battle in the West, but they are making up for it in Asia. Their tactics include falsely promoting filtered or mild cigarettes as less hazardous. They've also been funding research aimed at clouding public awareness about the health risks of secondhand smoke exposure. So in key markets of Indonesia and China, only 60 to 70% believe secondhand smoke causes illness. So I want to emphasize that, well, yes, maybe this is partly just due to lack of education and illiteracy or whatever, but no, that there is also a concerted disinformation campaign to make people not know the truth, that smoking isn't very good, right? How serious is this big tobacco disinformation campaign? Why am I starting with this example? Because of this, right? If you want to count the bodies that tobacco accounts for, last year there were around 25,600 deaths in terrorist attacks, according to US State Department figures, and around 6 million dying from tobacco use, according to the WHO. Yeah? This means that for every 1 terrorism fatality, there were around 234 deaths from tobacco. Right? To put it another way, if we think ISIS videos and other terrorist propaganda deserve a vigorous response, which of course they do, we should probably also worry a little bit about the marketing and disinformation tactics of these gentlemen. That's what the statistics tell us. Yeah? This is not just left-wing radical propaganda. That's what the statistics say. Just count the bodies. Second, fake news scandal of recent times, climate change denial. In 1838, Victoria was crowned Queen in London. This was before the telegraph, so by the time the news reached Singapore by steamship, it took 14 weeks before Singapore newspapers published the news of Queen Victoria's coronation. Yeah? 14 weeks for news from London to reach Singapore. Today, we're in the age of almost instantaneous global communication, so we assume that people should be getting the message a little faster than that. But here's the facts about how fast news travels when it comes to climate change. Since the 1990s, some 97% of scientists have agreed that man-made climate change is real. 20 years later, many Americans still don't know this. So the dynamics of climate change debate are broadly similar to the tobacco crisis. Conservative groups and energy corporations have for many years conducted disinformation campaigns to sabotage efforts to reduce fuel emissions. One key strategy has been to manufacture doubts about the strong scientific consensus that exists about man-made climate change. Now, considering that it gets harder and harder year by year to address the problem, the cost of this perception gap is mind-boggling. Public knowledge, and therefore public policy, is lagging behind the science by 1 or 2 decades with probably catastrophic results. Number 3 on my, in no particular order, number 3 in my greatest hits list of fake news, hate propaganda. Hate propaganda always employs disinformation tactics. Behind every genocide, ethnic cleansing, behind calls to get rid of immigrants or suppress a religious sect, you will find the deliberate propagation of lies. There are limitless cases that we can draw from. Let me start with our favorite newsmaker, the occupant of this mansion. Here's just one example of how fake news has fed into the national conversation in the US. The US has a number of think tanks that are devoted to generating disinformation about Muslims. One of the leading ones is the Center for Security Policy, which has been labeled by the country's most respected hate watch group, the Southern Poverty Law Center, as an extremist organization. According to a very dubious Center for Security Policy poll, 1/4 of Muslims believe in violent jihad against Americans. I mean, on the face of it, it's a ridiculous number. 1/4 of Muslims in the US believing in violent jihad against Americans. And this poll has been quite decisively debunked as totally unreliable. That, of course, didn't stop Trump from using the figure in his first speech to call for a ban on Muslims traveling to the US. I mean, his lies about Muslims, a lot of it encouraged and generated by these think tanks dedicated to pumping out disinformation, have continued, and sometimes they've been even too much for the right-wing Fox News channel to take. Here's a clip that shows Donald Trump's exchange with Chris Wallace, who, as you may know, is one of the more balanced and responsible anchors on Fox News. Let's take a look at how this proceeds and pay special attention to how Chris Wallace tries to do the journalistically responsible thing of using facts to restrain Trump, in the end not quite succeeding. I hope the audio is on.
Now, Mr. Trump, there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world today. 1.6 billion, and according to the best experts, think tanks all around the world, they say at most 100,000 people are fighting for jihadist causes. That's less than, it's a tiny fraction of 1%. So why draw a battle line against an entire religion, including major countries that are helping us in the fight against ISIS?
You're saying that out of 1.5 billion, 100,000, right? Let me tell you, whoever did that survey was about as wrong as you can get. It's 27%, could be 35%, would go to war. The hatred is tremendous, Chris. Now, look,
wait, you're saying 250, you're saying 250, 300 million Muslims would go to war against us?
Why don't you take a look at the Pew poll that came out very recently, or fairly recently, where I think the number, I mean, I could be corrected in this, whatever it is, but it was something like 27%.
So when I came across this, I happened to be watching TV that day, I guess. I was quite struck because he actually, for a change, he actually cited the source, which is Pew, which is an extremely respected research organization in the U.S. that does a lot of the best research in the country on issues like religion and politics. Yeah. So I tried to find out more about this and couldn't, wondered when the American media were going to report it, and seemed to have just dropped into a black hole. And what I subsequently discovered was that most of the US media did the right thing. They as well did their checks, found out that this was just a complete pack of lies and just ignored it. Yeah? By and large, the only American media that reported the statement from Trump were those that used this to show that Trump was lying. Yeah? So here's a sample of them, where it's very clear from the headlines that Trump was not telling the truth. And so these articles were using Trump's speech to show what a compulsive liar that he was. Yeah? Which is exactly the right way I think media should respond when even top newsmakers don't tell the truth. So most checked, realized that it was nonsense, and didn't give it the publicity. I asked the standards editor of the Associated Press why they didn't report it, and yes, he confirmed that it was because, in fact, they often don't report politicians when they are telling outrageous lies, because why help to spread the rubbish that they're talking about? Unfortunately, the National Wire Agency of India did file a story, which was run in many major news outlets, such as the Times of India and the Hindustan Times here. The PTI, the Press Trust of India story, acknowledged that Trump's statistics were controversial, but didn't tell readers whether they were correct. So Indian media are normally very careful about reporting what they call communal issues, but here was a case of completely uncritical repeating of outrageous lies by a newsmaker, signaling to the readers that, yes, these are controversial statistics, but not bothering to check whether there was any truth in them. Yeah? And even providing the source, that this was a Pew Research figures, which means that they could have easily checked back with Pew about whether such research actually existed, but PTI didn't. And as a result, several reputable Indian news publications carried this. As I said, Indian media are normally very careful about reporting of domestic communal issues, but that doesn't really stop the flow of hate propaganda within India, because they can always be spread by direct marketing. They don't really need the media to do the dirty work. This direct marketing can take the form, of course, of political rallies, speeches, posters, grassroots campaigns, and so on. And here's, from India, one of the cleverest disinformation campaigns that I've come across. I've written about this in my book, Hate Spin. It's called the Love Jihad conspiracy theory. So the story behind this theory is that there are these young Muslim men in their thousands who are seducing away innocent Hindu girls and then forcing them to convert to Islam. The grand plan here is to convert India, which is now almost 80% Hindu, into a Muslim nation. Yeah? It's always amazed me that the land of my forefathers, who are known for their mathematical prowess, could get such calculations, so pluck calculations out of thin air that are so wildly unbelievable. But that is in fact believed, that through this campaign of love jihad, India will one day become a majority Muslim country. Yeah? It's a very clever campaign because it gets round the inconvenient fact that, in fact, there is no significant homegrown Muslim terrorism in India. Right? So those who are anti-Muslim can't really point to Muslim terrorists as the end of India. So instead, they've got to invent this more grassroots narrative. Yes, there are no suicide bombers of Indian origin blasting up Indian capitals, but beware this Indian guy on a motorcycle in your village. Yeah? He could be stealing away your daughter. One of the most ingenious aspects of this particular disinformation campaign is that many of the flyers and posters will carry a hotline number. So you see it at the bottom corner of this poster in orange. Now think about it. If you saw a hotline number on any kind of public communication, you would normally assume that there must be a real problem here. Right? Why would anyone set up a hotline number if there wasn't an urgent problem to solve? Yeah, so for example, if you saw a message like this, right, constantly coming to your phone, WhatsApp, you see little ads being taken out, right? My guess is that many of us would start worrying about our phones. What, is it getting too hot? Is it going to explode? Yeah? That there must be a problem. That's why else is there this hotline that's been set up for exploding iPhones, right? This probably won't happen because in the case of the Apple iPhone 8, because Apple has enough high-paid lawyers to quickly crush any such campaign. Yeah? But vulnerable minority communities in any country don't have the power that Apple does. Yeah? If a hotline is set up saying, beware the Muslims in your midst because they may steal away your Hindu daughters, you can't really reach for defamation law because in most countries, defamation protects small individuals or small groups of individuals. Legally, it's not possible to defame an entire community. So you're pretty much helpless, yeah, against this kind of hate propaganda. What are the effects of this? Well, the worst riots in India just before the 2015 general election were in a place called Muzaffarnagar, and subsequent investigations, including by Frontline magazine, where our Asia fellow Vikar is from, showed that the love jihad narrative had played a role. Yeah? The deliberate spread of the love jihad theory had in fact convinced many ordinary Hindus in the community that this was going on and that they really couldn't, that they had to attack Muslims in their community out of self-defense, right? We have to protect our daughters and our wives. Number 4 on my list of fake news greatest hits is the US conquest of Iraq. So this was an invasion built on a set of lies, that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction and that he was supporting Al-Qaeda. These were not innocent intelligence errors. These involved the deliberate boosting of theories known to be dubious for the deliberate purpose of misleading the American public as well as the international community that there was an urgent need for a military invasion. Since 2003, this conflict built on lies has claimed around 4,500 lives on the American side and maybe 400 to 500,000 Iraqi lives. Which, by the way, still means that if you want to use disinformation purely to kill people rather than conquer territory, it's still more efficient to market tobacco than to sell a war. But from these 4 cases, let me make a few preliminary observations. First, disinformation is not just about the internet. Yeah? The internet is new, but in most serious disinformation campaigns, it's multimedia, often doesn't really need the internet to fly. Second, disinformation exploits people's poor understanding of risk, of weighing evidence and reading statistics. This is why there's been some investment in data visualization, for example, as a key means of improving people's literacy when it comes to risk. One simple example of how the news media can help is just in presenting data in a more honest way. Yeah? This graph makes it seem as if the green bar is twice the height of the blue bar, but that's only because we started the bar at 75. Yeah? If you started at 0, it's not such a big rise. Yeah? And then if you include the margin of error, it turns out that this may not be a rise at all. It could actually be a fall. Yeah? So are we being too demanding when we ask that news media, responsible news media, work these sorts of nuances into their statistics? I don't think so. In fact, Der Spiegel in Germany now shows margins of error routinely in its graphs. Yeah? And I don't see any reason why any art department in any news organization shouldn't do the same. Yeah? It's not too much to ask. We also know from these examples that disinformation routinely exploits the fear of the other. It's just a very easy way to win votes and to win support. And finally, I think we need to understand that disinformation is produced by skillful professionals with more creativity and often more time than most journalists have. You may have seen this video that came out from the University of Washington last month to show how advanced the technology has become. It uses real audio from Obama's, one of Obama's speeches, or I think it was an interview. See if you can tell which is the real video.
To help families refinance their homes, to invest in things like high-tech manufacturing, clean energy, and the infrastructure that creates good new jobs. Not to mention the job training that helps folks earn new skills to fill those jobs. The results are clear.
They're all fake, right? What about this?
Although I'm honored, and I think people can say that my election symbolizes some progress, at least within the small confines of the legal community, I think it's real important to keep the focus on the broader world out there.
So this is what the technology is capable of. Yeah? This is what a sophisticated disinformation campaign could look like very, very soon. We could, for example, invent speeches by Lee Kuan Yew, yeah, and make them go viral, saying whatever it was the organization behind it wanted it to say. Yeah? You could have Lee Kuan Yew coming back to scold his siblings, his children, scold one child, or rather the other two, or scold two as opposed to one, and the possibilities are endless. Yeah? What do we know then about the fake news ecosystem that is in front of us? And I thought it's useful to try and see where the problem lies. The most obvious, of course, would be fake news media that deliberately carry content intended to deceive. There are actually not that many of them, but they're worth paying attention to. One of them, more famous ones, would be InfoWars in the US. Yeah? A Singaporean one that got into trouble called Real Singapore. Not ideologically driven, more profit-driven, which is, of course, the ideology of Singapore. Simply fake news as clickbait, yeah? Generating traffic that translates into income, since fear, since immigrant bashing and so on do generate eyeballs. This then becomes a website that promotes fear of immigrants and so on. Yeah? But the idea is just to make money out of it. We contrast this with professional media that believe in presenting trustworthy stories based on verified info. Of course, when you put in a box, it's always oversimplifies reality. Are there media in between? Probably. I mean, I would say that Hannity, the Hannity program on Fox is an example of something that appears professional, but probably leans towards fake news. Similarly, Amir Liaquat in Pakistan, I don't know whether he could be considered in that gray area between professional media and fake news. To make life more complicated, we also know that fake stories and fake information in truthful stories often leak into professional media. This risk, I would say, is increasing simply because the battle is becoming less and less balanced. For every one journalist trying to put out a truthful story, there are more than one PR and marketing professionals trying to sell them an untrue story. Yeah? And as budgets get cut within newsrooms, there's a higher chance that, for example, video releases, B-rolls prepared by sophisticated marketing campaigns will be run unedited in reliable news outlets. So this is a problem with reducing capacity of professional media. Then you have social media that includes both trustworthy stories and fake news stories. You have what you could call PR media, media created by organizations, which would include a mix of fake and trustworthy stories. An example of a fake news site by a non-media organization would be Jihad Watch, which is basically an anti-Muslim website developed by a hate group in the US. An example of a trustworthy organizational website would be the WHO, World Health Organization website. So it includes a huge mix of kinds of media, so that creates kind of a fourth box. So it's an extremely complex picture. This, of course, is oversimplified. Those of you who are not uncomfortable with complexity, will quibble and say, no, the boxes shouldn't be this shape. In fact, they overlap. So for you, those who prefer more complexity, I would say that the real picture looks like this, right? That's the media ecosystem, right? But I think it's still kind of better to sort of simplify it a little so that we get a handle on it. I've also found on the internet a very scientific graphic depicting the state of our minds as a result of this media ecosystem, and it's this, right? But what are a few takeaways from this that I'd like to leave you with? First, I think it's clear that we're dealing with a market failure in the sense that this is not a situation that we can simply say that truth will overcome falsehood if we just leave things alone. There is an invisible hand in this marketplace, but the invisible hand is often trying to mislead and deceive. It's not a neutral, invisible hand, which is why we need interventions like fact-checking sites, like Verifiles that we'll hear about more tomorrow. We need interventions like internet intermediaries playing a more responsible role to try and tilt the balance on their sites while preserving the principle of internet neutrality. Here's an example where I think they are, in fact, moving in the right direction. Last year, as early as last year, if you typed in jihad in the Google search engine, one of the top entries you would find is Jihad Watch, which is an explicitly, openly anti-Muslim site. It would be probably number 2 behind Wikipedia. I tried it today. What do you find? Google has somehow dragged Jihad Watch down. Instead, what you have is much more reliable information about jihad. You find dictionary entries, you find reliable news entries, Washington Post, National Geographic, BBC, etc. It's only on the second page that Jihad Watch appears. So Jihad Watch hasn't been censored, but it's been dropped down, which is, I think, the kind of thing that we're asking Google to do. Of course, this does not mean that Jihad Watch is defeated. On the contrary, the site makes political mileage out of the fact that Google Watch is now trying to censor it, which means that what Google did last month may well translate into more donations to Jihad Watch this month, very likely, because it's able to portray Google's actions as once again being a plot of the liberal left. So this is a battle. It is not an innocent marketplace. This is an ongoing battle. So he's using it to promote his book. It's clear to me that if any government is serious about tackling fake news, it has to do it in a way that doesn't undermine professional media capacity. It seems obvious that professional media are an essential partner to combating disinformation. I'd go so far as to say that if a government claims to be tackling fake news, while at the same time diminishing the capacity of professional media in various ways, censorship, just making the job more difficult, etc., it is not really combating fake news. All it wants to do is to monopolize fake news, right? It wants to be the sole organization or the sole power center capable of pumping out disinformation. And what it's upset with is the fact that other people are also in the disinformation business. If it is sincere about tackling fake news, it should in fact be doing everything it can to develop media capabilities. Finally, I think we should invest more in media literacy, things like critical thinking skills. There are scholars talking about how debunking fake news is not enough. We have to think about pre-bunking it. What does this mean? It means cluing in people even before the disinformation starts that this is how the world works. This is, in fact, something that I try to do in my book, Hate Spin, to let people know that this is how hate propagandists work in general. So if you see it happening in your society, you know the game that is being played, right? You know that these are political opportunists using our fear of the other for their own political ends. So that's the kind of critical education that I think is extremely important for any society trying to build up resilience against disinformation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherian. Let us invite the chairperson for the opening keynote, Kenneth Paul Tan. Kenneth is a dear colleague, and he's an associate professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Kenneth is an outstanding educator, and he has won many, many awards for teaching. He's also a very well-known public thought leader, and he served on the committee for our Singapore National Conversation in 2012, which is a nationwide year-long public engagement exercise. Thank you, Kenneth.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Cherian. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you speak, and as always, also, you're thought-provoking, but at the same time, very clarifying. So that's wonderful to listen to that. I'm sure also his presentation has raised a lot of interest, and you'll probably have lots of questions for him. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for you to ask these questions and get them answered. So let me suggest that we try and be very economical in the way that we ask the questions, be clear. Please do say who you are and where you're from also. I think that would be quite helpful to us. So do we have a first question? Please, come to there are mics, there are standing mics in the aisle, so come to the mics. And others, if you've got questions, also please go straight to the mic so we can get to you immediately after.
Hello. Are we on? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, so I'm Eric Wishart from AFP News Agency. And very interesting, Cherian, thank you. I'd like to come back to the government role. I've been in AFP for 30 years, and I've yet to really see an example where government intervention in the media and freedom of speech has had a positive effect. So I know they're talking about introducing legislation in Singapore. So I'd really like you to expand, if you could, Cherian, in your thought. Is there any justification for any government involvement in this, or should the fight against fake news and disinformation be really debunking the social media platforms, the media literacy? Do you see any role for governments, or do you think government should stay out of it? Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. It's odd to have the first question from a fellow Hong Konger. We could have had this conversation back home, right?
FCC.
That's right. No, I absolutely do believe that the state does have an important role. But remember that the state has many body parts other than teeth. In other words, we have multiple policy instruments at the state's disposal other than punitive or restrictive laws and regulations. It can provide arm's length funding for fact-checking projects that build up resilience against disinformation. It can support media literacy efforts. It can also support higher quality journalism by supporting independent public service media, like what the Europeans are more familiar with, like the BBC, rather than what many Asians are familiar with, which is really government-run media. It can also support initiatives like independent press councils. I believe my Indonesian friends have to verify this, that the Indonesian government does provide some support for the Indonesian Press Council. Is that right? It does. But that does not compromise the Indonesian Press Council's perceived independence. It is still regarded within the media profession as an extremely respectable organization. Yeah? So it is possible to have state funding, taxpayer funding, with a very strict arm's length relationship from government. And I think if we do that, then yes, of course, the state has an important role. I think I'll add a couple of points to that. Number one, that not just among governments, but even among educators and others, there's this obsession with the internet, right? Because it is new and its effects are unfamiliar. But I think it's careful, we need to be careful about prioritizing. If we actually look at the most damaging instances of fake news and disinformation, we quickly realize that actually the internet is just a small part of it. Yeah? So I'm very suspicious of the overreaction to the internet as the great danger. Yeah? many disinformation campaigns, once you peel it back, you'll quickly realize that no, the big players you should be going after are, for example, these think tanks that are producing funny science and hate propaganda. The internet is just a disinformation platform for them. Yeah? So I would say that there's probably too much attention, both academic and policy, given to internet right now. The other caveat, I guess, when I suggest that there is a role for state intervention, is that we need to start thinking about what the end goal is. When we start this conversation within countries about what the government can and should be doing about fake news, are we really suggesting that it is possible or desirable to eliminate completely the harms associated with fake news? Often it seems as if that is the end goal, but that's extremely unwise. I mean, let's think about how we manage other harms in our society. Think about the fact that every other day in Singapore, a human being dies on the roads. There's, in fact, a very simple way to practically eliminate road fatalities in Singapore, which is to reduce the speed limit to maybe 10 kilometers per hour. Yeah? You get practically instant results. And it's hard to imagine how else people would die in a vehicle that is not speeding. So let's just reduce it to 10 kilometers per hour. You can save 200 lives just like that every year. Yeah? But no, what our societies have done with that risk and many other similar risks is to implicitly decide that no, there's a certain amount of tolerable risk and tolerable fatalities even in return for the freedoms that we enjoy. Yeah? How else does that make sense? I mean, how else can we make sense of the fact that in spite of knowing that these high speed limits are killing people, we still live with it? We, in fact, make this trade-off. We make this trade-off in so many different areas, not just in the way we manage our roads. So I would say let's make the same kind of trade-off with the internet. Yeah? I don't think it should be considered radically outrageous to suggest that we should learn to live with a certain amount of chaos and pollution in our communication space, because that same communication space gives us so many incredible benefits. Many of those benefits far outstrip the benefits of driving your car at 80 kilometers per hour, which is the speed limit on many Singapore roads. Yeah? So there is this threshold issue to consider. In some domains, I think it is fair to want to minimize the risk to the bare minimum. And I'm thinking, for example, of disinformation concerning health and medical information. Yeah? This, again, is not a new idea. In many countries, including Singapore, our regulations concerning the advertising of health products and medicines are far stricter and backed by law compared with other regulations. And this is an implicit acknowledgement that certain kinds of misinformation and exaggeration are simply not socially acceptable. So that's the kind of, I think, discussion we should be having around fake news, which are the very specific, most dangerous forms of fake news, where there's very objective evidence that this information causes harm. Then by all means, bring in the law. Yeah? And certainly when it comes to medical information about epidemics and so on, I think you do want the government to come in very strongly. But information about politics, information and ideas that help political debate is not in that category. Yeah? It is far more subjective. You cannot say that the scientific medical consensus is that we need to respect our leaders and therefore anything that's disrespectful is disinformation. No, that's ridiculous. Yeah? So let's think a lot more clinically about government intervention, I think.
James.
James, hello, is that James Crabtree? I'm with the Lee Kuan Yew School. Thank you, Cherian. That was a fascinating lecture. You mentioned towards the beginning of your remarks Russia, and so the problem of state actors who are generating and disseminating fake news. I wondered if you thought there was any risk of state actors in Asia doing this, so not Russia, but other countries. And if so, what should be done about that? How does the national security dimension of this change the way in which you think people should respond to the phenomenon of fake news?
Well, that's an easy one to answer because I can quickly say that I know nothing about it. It's just outside my area. You have to ask, I guess, people at the Rajaratnam school, and I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, a security person, so I wouldn't know. Does anyone else? Let's turn this to a conversation. Is anyone familiar with foreign state actors intervening in?
Would you like to take that?
Was that a separate question? Is a different question?
Different question, no?
Okay, let's move on then.
Hello. One of the elements of the of journalism is principle of verification. I think the journalism does that. I know there are many arms to verify information, but it is not new phenomena. Like recently, it's been a new phenomena. So the elements of journalism are able to curb fake news phenomena of present day.
Sorry, are the elements of journalism?
Elements of journalism are able to curb fake news phenomena of recent days.
Right. I do think, the question I think is whether those basic fundamentals of journalism that are contained in a book like Elements of Journalism, are they still relevant for today? Definitely, yeah. I think this is a call to return to those basics of verification. But I think what we have to acknowledge is that it is becoming a tougher and tougher battle simply because there are fewer journalists doing it relative to the number of people on the other side. By other side, I mean the skillful, talented individuals who are in the business of disinformation. Yeah? This is a point that is investigated very well in the book Flat Earth News by Nick Davis, who pointed out that for any major controversy where a major corporate or government is involved, think about the effort that goes into preparing the spin. Yeah? Let's say a company wants to convince people that a new chemical plant is clean when it's not. You can anticipate that there would be maybe a team of 10 people preparing over 6 months media strategy and a public communication strategy to sell the idea that this chemical plant is clean. Yeah? Then the press release comes out, and you have one reporter given half a day to write up the story. That's not the ingredients. That's not a scenario that that makes it possible to exercise the kind of verification journalism that we need. Yeah? And we need to acknowledge that. The problem here is not that the principles of journalism are unsound. It's just that there are too few of us doing it, and that is not going to change, of course, until you address the basic problems of economic sustainability and so on.
Please.
My name is Noyon, and I am from Bangladesh. So first, I want to know what do you think? Is there any economical issue behind the fake news? And if you think this is yes, so when the tobacco industries and arm industries are very powerful, economically powerful, and they invest lots of money in the third world countries, how the third world countries can stop this kind of fake news?
There are some parts I couldn't hear because you turned away from the mic.
Okay. tobacco industries and arms industries.
Tobacco industries and?
Arms industries.
Arms industries,
yes.
okay.
So they invest a lot of money in the third world countries.
Right.
Especially their tobacco industries. So when they invest a lot of money, how can the third world countries can stop the fake news in newspaper or the media?
I wish I had the answer. I would see. I would take that as highlighting a serious problem for which the world does not have an answer yet. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight it as a huge problem, right? And I wish that's precisely the kind of fake news conversation we should be having, yeah. Instead of what passes off for fake news debate. Certainly in the Western press, and it spills over into countries like Singapore, that is focusing, I think, on fairly trivial things compared with the problems you're talking about. Yeah. So certainly you can't divorce. We shouldn't forget these big players involved. Which relates to the point I was making that no, this is much more than just the fact that now there are these, social media guys putting out fake news or the hackers. No, we're talking about things like the military-industrial complex. We are talking about big tobacco and so on, with resources that are just, mind-boggling compared with what, say, an independent news website has to do investigative journalism and so on. And when those are the stakes, and when that's the imbalance of power, yes, of course it is an issue of grave public concern. And yes, as societies, we have to find ways to fix it. But unfortunately, that's not where most of our conversations are heading. Yeah? And certainly too many of our conversations are devoted to the counterproductive solutions of, how can we make the independent media behave more responsibly by restraining them even more, and thus reducing our capacity to stand up to to powerful interests.
Hi, my name is Sharmila. I'm from Malaysia. One of the issues that my country, and certainly I think a lot of other countries are facing, is a general lack of faith and trust in the mainstream media, largely because a lot of our media is partially or fully state-owned or funded by the state and so on. And this has caused a lot of our audiences to turn towards other sources of news, and it's come to a point where practically anything that we say is often considered to be fake and unreliable. However, these institutions are still the places where the journalists with the training and who actually go out and do the work and try and verify and put out decent news work. So what would you advise be to the journalists who are working within these systems, who may not necessarily consider themselves mouthpieces of the government and are trying to put out good work, but have to combat against the accusation of being purveyors of fake news or government propaganda? Thanks.
Well, I think that there are two separate problems that reinforce one another here. The traditional problem, which is still serious, is just simple government restrictions on media, which most of Asia is very familiar with and still struggling against. But what I'm hearing from journalists in more and more countries is that this is now reinforced by maybe a newer trend, where in the past, journalists facing pressure from government could count on the public to stand up for them. Now it seems that the public hates them too. Yeah? So populism is actually used as an instrument against the press, even as the press insists that we are the voices of public opinion. It turns out that the public doesn't think so. Yeah? And so this is a far more serious problem, because suddenly it means that in the past we could count on public opinion to enlarge the space for journalists. Now it's actually the reverse. And this is the interesting thing, of course, is that this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's happening not just in unfree countries, but also in free countries. It's happening in the US and happening in Britain elsewhere. So why is this? I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think like many others, my instinctive reaction was at first to blame the public, yeah, because it's a much easier conclusion to come to. The sort of the deep dark secret that journalists don't tell others is that in fact we are as contemptuous of the public as other elites, right? The truth is most journalists don't think much of their audience. We tend to look down on them, yeah? We think that in fact most of our audience is rather stupid and irrational. It shows in the kinds of things that they want to read. It shows in the kinds of questions they ask us and so on, right? So when something like this happens, when you find that the public is turning against the press, it's quite natural for journalists then to say, well, this just shows how stupid the public is, yeah? And certainly a lot of Americans, after looking at the backlash against the media, you know, instigated by Trump, have come to that conclusion. Their fellow citizens are stupid. It's an easy answer, but I think it's the wrong answer, right? Because I think we haven't actually taken a good look in the mirror, and I think if we did, we would realize that, you know, the instruments of reason that I was talking about earlier, yeah? Asking questions, searching for truth. Yes, in a sense, we've gotten quite good at the methodology of it, right? We've gotten good at the craft of it, but I think throughout the world, the problem has been that we have used those skills, that craft, to answer the wrong questions, yeah? We have not been asking the questions that actually matter to the weak and disenfranchised in our country, yeah? To those who are actually being hurt by globalization and so on. So as a result, you know, we have journalists pursuing stories and asking questions that actually don't matter to the lived lives of people who are now turning against us. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that among our middle-class readers and viewers in most of the countries represented here, they would probably this week know more about the Taylor Swift case than about, say, any new developments in urban poverty, why unemployment persists, and so on, right? Chronic healthcare problems. Why in the world do so many Asians need to know about Taylor Swift? Yeah, and the fact that she won $1 in a case against a groper. And if that is the kind of use to which we have been putting our craft, is it any wonder that we have lost credibility and people don't think we're on their side? Yeah.
So there's this mutual disdain between the establishment media and then the public, the reading public. Maybe I wonder if you could say something a bit more about the recommendations that you made that might relate to this, in particular journalistic capacity on the one hand, but also media literacy. Right? Are there some good principles that might inform these two?
Well, the problem of a profession that has gotten distant from its audience is extremely difficult to address within the commercial model that we've adopted. Yeah? We like to tell ourselves that we treat members of the public as equals, but of course we don't. Yeah? In fact, we segregate our audience depending on their value to advertisers, rather than based on their on the principle of equality that our constitutions protect. Yeah? I don't know any commercial media that actually seriously acts as if every person in the society is equal. No, obviously they don't, right? It is the interests and values and lifestyles of markets that are valuable to advertisers that get the most attention. How do you break that when, in fact, you are dependent on advertising revenue? Extremely difficult. Yeah? The most rational way to do it, of course, is to have public service media that are mandated to look after the interests of the general population, regardless of their willingness to pay. Yeah? Unfortunately, there have been no recent cases of developing independent public service media in Asia. Yeah? All the best practices were from several decades ago, experiments in Europe, Canada, Australia. Japan may come the closest. Indonesia, I guess, has some hope of developing one, an independent public service broadcaster. Very difficult to see it happening elsewhere.
What's preventing that from happening? Why aren't people reclaiming some of these earlier experiments?
Oh, simply because the idea of separating the public interest and the responsibilities of the state from the power of the government is something that has been extremely difficult to achieve. Yeah? So in most of our countries, the government is equated with the state and the public. And if you do not separate them, then this experiment just doesn't work. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Good evening. I am Tashi, and I'm from Bhutan. I work with Kinsel, that's the national newspaper. Like my question is, when we talk of fake news, I understand that it's mostly people with anonymous account who write. I think when I ask the question, I think I'll put more in Bhutanese perspective. The situation in Bhutan right now is that there are people who, with their fake accounts, write anything they want. And the general understanding among people is that people who have anonymous accounts, especially on Facebook, cannot be traced. So please forgive me for my ignorance. I just wanted to know from extreme, people hear that whether people using anonymous account on Facebook can ever be traced. I ask this especially in the context that Facebook, people using anonymous Facebook accounts, they try to discredit mainstream media, right? And then there are people without much media literacy, they believe that. And like Cherian pointed out, in many states, instead of trying to curb that situation of fake news, they try to question the mainstream media, and then where the credibility is at loss. So I just wanted to know how such situation could be overcome.
Yeah, the problem of anonymous trolling is bothersome for media, and it's sad that Bhutan has it. But I guess be glad that some of the more organized campaigns haven't hit you yet, and maybe it will. Right? But what do we do about anonymous trolling that does affect media? The question of whether it should be allowed on Facebook or and so on, I think that's I don't know if you have a Facebook representative tomorrow to help us answer that. We do, okay. So wait for tomorrow regarding Facebook policies. Yeah, I look forward to hearing that as well. At what point does something that is now just very irritating to journalists become a social problem that we have to worry about? I personally would be careful about overreacting to how dangerous these anonymous trolls are. Yeah. I'm not too concerned, to be very frank. I mean, although most of our guests do work for organizations and for news organizations and depend on them for a living, I'm not too worried about news organizations being insulted unfairly and so on, because by and large, the big organizations can look after themselves. Yeah, so I'd be much more worried about anonymous trolling of individual victims, yeah, which I'm sure also does happen in Bhutan, right? In Singapore, we have an anti-harassment law that presumably is meant to help such victims of anonymous harassment. I'm not sure how well it's working, but certainly vulnerable victims do need some kind of protection from it, in particular children, yeah, who are often the overlooked victims. It would be nice if at least half the attention given to the fake news problems that the governments of the world face were given to kids who really are suffering as a result of online bullying. Yeah? That, I think, would be a much a welcome reprioritization of our efforts.
Okay, let's maybe take the last two or three questions. Shall we take them in
sure.
In
Okay.
yeah. So, and then you.
Hi, I'm Chris Lau from the South China Wing Post in Hong Kong. Nice to meet you, by the way. So I think my question is, sitting through the whole night, you know, we know there are fake news happening in the West, which, you know, kind of bring us to the attention. So what about the form of fake news that exists? Is it different when it happens in Asia compared to when it happened in the West? And also, from your, I don't know if you have an answer for this, but from your observation and research, are there particular regions in Asia that are specifically more inclined or vulnerable to fake news? Yeah, these are my questions.
I think there was another question also at that table. Would you like to ask it now?
Good evening, I'm John Neri. I'm an editor at the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Thank you for a provocative keynote, many practical applications, but I'm intrigued by the philosophical underpinning of your approach. You are asking us to consider the fake news problem from a longer term perspective, essentially as an enlightenment project gone awry. To surmount what you call a crisis of reason, I think the answer is a return to reason. And looking at your three takeaways, number 2 and number 3 are, pardon the pun, reasonable. Investing in critical thinking skills, building, or at least not undermining professional media capacity. My question has to do with the first. Is it in fact a case of market failure? The reason why fake news proliferates? I mean, the reason why Macedonian teenagers can influence a US election is because there's good money available. The reason why Philip Morris is able to kill millions of people every year is because they pay good money. Is it in fact a question of rehabilitating, you know, the market? Is the market in fact part of this return to reason?
I thought I saw another hand. Maybe just the last one. Oh, 2. Let's just take the last 2. And then.
Hello, I'm Deepal from India. What I want to know and your perspective is that, you know, fake news, as we see, like from the examples you gave, the tobacco industry, or even history, if we look at it, it has always existed. Why is this renewed attention to this phenomena of fake news when we've heard like fake news, fabricated news in history, right from the Egyptians or, you know, the colonial history, or from Germany, fabricated news or propaganda, but why this renewed attention and concern for fake news in this so-called post-truth age is what I want to know. Thank you.
Thank you. And
hello, I'm Bola from Mongolia. So my question is, should we hold online platforms accountable for fake news? And how can media policies help with their, I think online platforms are a big stakeholder in spreading fake news. Thank you.
Okay. Let me answer the last question first. What can online platforms like, say, Google and Facebook do? I think a lot more than they are doing, but less than some governments want them to do. Right? We wouldn't actually want them to go the way that some governments want them to do, because we do want to preserve their status as neutral conduits for information and not get too involved in content decisions, right? Having said that, I think they do have responsibility to do what they can to tilt the playing field to give an unfair advantage to things that are obviously true over things that are obviously false. And the example that I gave you of how somehow Google has altered its search algorithms when you search for Muslim terms and so on, you now actually are more likely to get reliable sources than just last year. Yeah? Shows that it can be done. For too long, the likes of Yahoo, Facebook, Google were insisting that, no, technically it's not possible. But what we've consistently seen is that when certain interests are touched, it miraculously becomes possible. Yeah? You may remember that one of the first cases was Yahoo fighting the French over whether it was possible to censor Nazi memorabilia from a Yahoo auction site. And at first they said technically not possible. They lost the case, went back to the US, and I guess because of the strength of the Jewish lobby in the US, suddenly it became technically possible. Yeah? And they actually did remove Nazi memorabilia from their auction sites. Why do they, and this goes, partially answers Deepal's question, why suddenly this interest and so on? Why suddenly has Google and Facebook, why are they suddenly so intent on solving the problem that just 2 years ago they denied existed practically? And of course it has to do with the US elections. So there is a bit of hypocrisy there. Whatever happened last year in the US, as shocking that it was, it pales, in the disinformation league table, it pales in comparison to the fact that disinformation was responsible for the deadliest, most unnecessary war of the 21st century. If you want to look at the standout case of disinformation, distorting the American democracy, it's in the invasion of Iraq. It's not in the election of Donald Trump. A lot of the questions that we're now asking about the power of disinformation, what in the world is going wrong with our marketplace of ideas, that it allowed the freest country in the world to be lied to, such that 4,500 of their countrymen were sent to their deaths, yeah, plus 400,000 Iraqis, but they're brown skinned, so who cares, right? How come the Americans were not having the conversation they're now having 14 years ago in 2003? Yeah? When you ask the question that way, the answer must surely be that even sending kids to war, because most of these would be working class American kids, did not shake the American establishment as much as the events of last year shook the American establishment. Yeah? When powerful American interests suddenly realized that this irrational populist wave was going out of their control, that's when suddenly we had to be interested in disinformation and fake news, right? Even the world's most unnecessary war of the 21st century didn't provoke them to do that. Yeah? That's the cynical answer to Deepal, or the skeptical answer, I'm not a cynic, right? The skeptical answer. I think another possible answer to your question of why now is that, in fact, well, we do in fact live in a much more complicated age, right? There's a much higher chance now simply because we are more crowded and more in each other's face. There's more chance of misunderstanding, more chance of being influenced for good or bad by people we don't know, right? Our circles are much more out of control and so on. It is genuinely more confusing time to sort out fact from fiction, yeah? So it is about time we started paying attention to this. The harm that can be caused by disinformation across borders and so on are probably more than they were before. Yeah? Going to John's point, which is related, is it a market failure? I'm using market here in a metaphorical sense, not the economic market. If you look at it as an economic market terms, yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah? To make those observations, but I'm looking at it in terms of this contest between truth and non-truth, which takes place in this marketplace of ideas. It's that marketplace that seems to be failing. Yeah? We had assumed that truth versus non-truth would give us better answers, in the same way that when the forces of demand and supply in an economic market produce more the kinds of goods that we want in the quantity that we want. In this marketplace of ideas, the free exchange of of this untrammeled exchange of information and ideas would produce the ideas that we need. Yeah? But that marketplace certainly is not in good shape. Yeah? We cannot leave it alone and assume that truth is going to triumph. So it's a serious problem. The final point about are some states some societies more vulnerable than others? Yes, but I guess in different ways. Yeah. So you might find some societies more vulnerable to certain types of disinformation because their states are too weak to stand up to powerful lobbies. Let me give you the example of Indonesia, where I was shocked to discover only recently that tobacco advertising isn't banned, right? And no wonder Indonesia is one of the main growth markets for tobacco, yeah? And that even respected newspapers like Kompas, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone from Kompas, but Kompas carries cigarette ads, yeah? Which is something that is not possible in most of the world. Tobacco advertising has been banned in most of the world. The fact that this kind of disinformation still penetrates a big market like Indonesia, I think has to do with political economy. Yeah? The fact that business plays a disproportionate role in the affairs of state. So that's one kind of vulnerability. Another might be just low constitutional protections for minorities. When you have countries that do not protect minority religions or minority languages and so on enough, then of course those societies become very vulnerable to disinformation campaigns propagating hate. Yeah? So the picture varies depending on where you look. There are different kinds of vulnerabilities that societies have. But I think we should, wherever we are, we should pay close attention to certain big risks that we know are already killing us, right? Health-related disinformation, climate change-related disinformation, hate-related disinformation is rampant, I think, throughout the world and especially in Asia.
So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. So will you please join me in thanking Cherian for making this a truly stimulating evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherian and Kenneth. I think some of you still have questions that you did not manage to ask, but we have the rest of the evening and the whole of tomorrow, so please keep those conversations going. So the keynote has certainly given us a lot of food for thought. Now it's time food for the body. So dinner will commence shortly. As dinner is being served, we would like to request that you bring back your name tag for tomorrow. We're trying to save the earth, so we're trying to minimize wastage, so bring this back. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.